Hi there. My name is Idowu Akinde. Everyone calls me ID. Without further ado, let's jump into season 1, episode 4 of the Dear Startup Founder series. Today, we'll be talking about failure. What is failure? And how important is it? All right, so 1 second. While I share my screen so that we can get cracking. Awesome. So, I approach this topic with the deepest respect for people's personal situations, personal contexts, many of which I probably would never really understand, right? And I do know that people really cognitively struggle with the concept of failure. People really struggle, exert themselves, stretch themselves, and try to achieve their goals without wanting to fail. And I get it. I understand it. Sometimes people don't have an option. People don't have a backup, a plan B, right? So I do understand what it means to fail. I do. And perhaps if time permits, maybe in a private session, or maybe some other day, maybe one of the subsequent sessions, I might share with you some of my own personal spectacular failures, right? So I actually do understand a little bit what it means to fail, right? Without any backup, without any plan B. However, if you are going to build a startup, and I think that this is one of my favorite topics to discuss in the startup development, startup building, series or, endeavor in the line of work that I do. Having the right mindset, or rather, let's reframe that. Thinking accurately about failure is absolutely unavoidable if you are going to build a successful startup. How do we define successful? We said a successful startup is enduring and fundable. A startup that lasts beyond 5 years and is attractive for funding. It's attractive to funders, investors. Everybody wants to build an enduring and fundable startup. And if you're one of those, then you need to pay attention to how you perceive, interpret, and generally relate with failure. The reason I have found, and I'll summarize. In summary, I can say that in summary, my observation is that the problem with failure comes from the fact that in the English language, there is only one word, failure, that is used to describe two concepts. Okay? So in the English language, there is failure, the event. There is the concept of an event that did not pan out or did not result in expectation. Okay? So that is failure, the event. Then there is failure, the identity, failure, the persona, failure, the embodiment, right? In a person. The problem is that many times when we hear and interpret the word failure, we unconsciously, most times, are thinking about failure, the identity, when we should be thinking about failure, the event. Okay? So why am I saying this? And I learned this from my pastor, Pastor Sam Adeyemi, great man. He helped me see this thing that I'm sharing today many years ago, more than 12 years ago. It's important to train yourself, right? To interpret the things that are going on in your life personally, within the startup space and without, in startup development and in other aspects of your life. If you're going to be a successful startup founder, you're going to have to train yourself to interpret events as they are occurring and tell yourself, that was a failure event. That does not define me as a failure. That was a failure event. That was not a failure. That is not a failure identity describing Idowu Akinde. Okay? And so when you, it takes a while, and I do appreciate this, right? And I do appreciate this. Is what I was trying to hint at earlier. I do appreciate that it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to reprogram a human mind. I do understand, right, that it takes a lot of work, but you can do it. If I can do it, if so many other people that I know can do it, you can do it. You can reprogram your mind to think about failure, the event, different from failure, the identity. Many times, right, a few parents, well-meaning, loving, absolutely well-intentioned parents, did not know better, and they saw a report card from a child, right, from their child, and they wanted to discipline and or scold and or shake up that child and help that child to wake up to a better performance in the future. But the words that came out of their mouth, when they intended to say, dear child, this report card is a failure event. But they ended up saying, dear child, this report card signals to me that you, your identity, your personality are a failure. So it's really, what's the word? Sublime, right? Ingrained into the language that we speak every day. But it's important to, where possible, when you remember, catch yourself mid-sentence or midway, and just if it requires extracting yourself from a situation and going to a private place and reminding yourself, failure, the event is different from failure, the identity. This almost magically transforms your ability to survive building a startup. Let me give you a trick. And I'm going to be very honest here. I'm going to be brutally honest here. The big problem with building startups, the really big problem with building startups, this doesn't just apply to Nigerian or African startups. This is a global phenomenon. The really big problem with building startups is that at any point in time, there are all sorts of variables that are beyond the control of the founders, beyond your control as a founder, that can kill your startup. That's the big problem, okay? And so, failure is literally inevitable. There's something from somewhere, there's a curveball from somewhere that you did not think of and that you were not prepared for when it happened. Or you thought of it, but you didn't think of it that it will happen today or yesterday or last week, right? So I'd implore everyone, to think seriously about how they process the word failure. It is possible to shoot arrows from a bow at a target, and 20 times out of 20 times, you never actually hit the target. Now, two people could interpret that scenario. Two people could have that identical scenario and interpret and have two different interpretations for that. Interpretation one is, oh, I have tried 20 times and I have not hit one target. I must be a crap. What's the word for archer? I must be a crap archer. I must be a failure at archery. There's another person that's going to experience that and is going to say, I've done it 20 times but I have not yet hit the target. And startup building is all about modulating your own, regulating your own internal system, your own internal emotions, and helping yourself stay the distance. Helping yourself survive failure events after failure events after failure events after failure events for as long as it takes, for as many failure events as it takes, until you arrive at the event that you can call a success. Just to round up, every time you have a failure event, it will help to ask yourself the question, did I fail? If the answer is yes, accept that answer wholeheartedly, embrace it, and accept it, okay? And tell yourself that is a yes. But then ask yourself the second question. Having failed, are you a failure? Of course not. Of course not. You are not a failure. I don't know your personal situation, but there are so many things that if I were to meet you one-on-one, that I could tell you about yourself within 1 hour, that you are better than myself, that you're better than I am at, and, if that goes for me, goes for millions of people around the world. There's something you're good at. So there's nobody that is a failure, quote unquote, failure identity, except for those that have accepted it to be their reality. So where do we land? I always like to finish up this conversation around failure with a sentence or with a quip, a quote, whatever you want to call it, just a thought, okay? And it goes like this. You can go from failure to failure to failure to failure to failure onto another failure, and failure, and finally land on success, the set of conditions that you expected from the beginning of all the exercises, without becoming a failure in the midst of all those 9 failures. You can see that I've used the 2 contexts in the same sentence. And if you didn't have the insight of our earlier definition of the failure event versus the failure identity, you might even be confused by what I just said. But in summary, what I just said is that there is somebody who just went through 9 failure events, finally landed on their 10th attempt on success, but they did not become a failure through those 10 attempts. There's another person that is going to go through 2, maybe 3 attempts and is going to become a failure because they are going, well, not necessarily because they are a failure, but because they choose to accept that the failure identity is the interpretation they want to choose for these failure events, these 3 failure events. Am I saying then that the ability to maintain enthusiasm through multiple failure events is critical for startup building? Absolutely yes. And if anybody gets that, I'm a happy man. My job is done. Let's hang it here today. Thank you very much once again, as I always say, thank you for tolerating my hallucinations. See you on the next one.